Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our next session, which begins with Professor Olga Palagia, Professor Emerita of the National and Kapodistrian University. I often think Olga must get very bored of everyone beginning one of her presentations saying, Olga needs no introduction, because it's absolutely true. One of the world's leading experts, of course, on Greek sculpture and indeed art more generally. Her publications are absolutely voluminous. It would take our entire session just to read out the titles. A dear friend and of course a very, very well-known scholar. She's going to talk to us today about an experimental component, ancient Greek athletics. You're most welcome, Olga.
Well, thank you, Robert, for the introduction and the invitation. I'm very happy to say that I have also been taught by Haradza-Vela Evgen when I was in high school. Before she started teaching archaeology, she was, for a very brief period, she was also a high school teacher in Athens. And another good thing is that finally my university changed its name back to Athens University. For several years, we were called the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, which was very hard. Well, they got tired of it. So we're back to the University of Athens. Now, this paper will discuss athletic portraits documented to have been set up after the athlete's death, and in some cases, several generations after their victories. The question of representation of the athlete's feature, of course, does not arise, for they were not real portraits. The reasons for these belated dedications vary, and we will discuss them as the cases arise. We will deal with portraits dedicated in the archaic and classical periods in places like Sparta, Phigalia, Argos, Olympia, and Delphi. The dedicants were either the city-states or the families of the victors. In one case, the statue was awarded by the organizers of the Nemean Games in atonement for the athlete's death at the hands of his opponent. Our narrative mostly depends on the testimony of Pausanias, who saw these statues in the third quarter of the 2nd century AD, and in some cases recorded the epigrams on their bases. In the case of the Daukos monument in Delphi, however, that was not seen by Pausanias, our evidence comes from the inscriptions on the statue bases. We begin with the statue in Sparta. When Pausanias visited the sanctuary of Apollo at Amyklai in Laconia, he remarked on the stele of the pentathlete Ainitos, who gained immortality, not because he was an Olympic victor, but because he dropped dead the moment he was being crowned victor. Pausanias goes on to mention a portrait, icon, of the athlete, and it is not clear if he means the image on the stele or whether he saw an additional portrait statue placed next to the stele. In any case, the athlete's image was posthumous and could not have been lifelike because he was already dead and they didn't really remember him. We should mention that Ainitos does not appear in any Olympic victor's list, and the date of his victory is unknown. The commemoration of the Spartan Olympic victor Chionis in Olympia furnishes an example of a stele carrying the Olympic victor's name and the statue that was set up next to it. We may therefore wonder if Ainitos was commemorated in a similar way. In the case of Chionis, the stele could have predated the statue, for he gained 3 Olympic victories in 664, 660, and 656 BC, and his statue was created much later in the severe style by the sculptor Myron of the mid-5th century. But Pausanias himself remarks that not only the statue, but also the stele was dedicated by the Spartans long after the athlete's death, because what he read in the stele contained information that was unknown in Chionis's own time. In any case, we will never know if the stele and the statue were set up together. Chionis later participated in the colonization of Cyrene. He was therefore a historical figure of some importance. He was also commemorated with an inscribed stele in the city of Sparta itself, which was also seen by Pausanias. And the stele said that he had won additional victories besides the Olympic Games. One of the earliest athletes honored with the posthumous statue was the Pancratiast Arakion of Phigalia in Arcadia. He won in the Olympic Games of 572 and 564. Even though he was killed by his opponent in 564, the judges awarded him the crown after his death because they deemed it was not a fair fight. The Phigalians erected his statue in their agora, probably soon after his death, because Pausanias remarks that the statue looked archaic, with feet close together and arms by the sides, so like a kouros. A similar situation occurred with the wrestler Krougas of Epidamnos, who was unlawfully killed by his opponent in the Nemean Games in the 4th century, at a time when the games were being managed by the archives. He was awarded the crown after his death, and the archives honored him with a statue in the sanctuary of Apollo Lykios in Argos. Even though Argos was not his native city, the erection of his statue by the archives was very likely an act of piety. As the organizers of the Nemean Games, the archives must have felt responsible for any misconduct that resulted in loss of life. Moving on to Olympia, we come across Oibotas of Dymi, a runner who won in the 6th Olympiad in 756. He was thus one of the earliest Olympic winners and the earliest Olympic victor from Achaea. Pausanias informs us that Oibotas cursed the Achaeans not to win another race because they did not honor him. We do not know in what manner he expected to be honored, because the custom of erecting statues to Olympic victors probably had not been introduced at that time. It appears that Oibotas' spell held for 3 centuries, so the Achaeans did not win another game. So they consulted the oracle at Delphi in the 5th century. Apollo advised them to set up a statue in Olympia. The Achaeans promptly erected a posthumous portrait of Oibotas in Olympia during the 80th Olympiad, which would be around 460, and the spell was broken, so they started winning. It appears that Oibotas' statue became the recipient of cult. Achaean athletes sacrificed to him before the games, and crowned the statue after the victory, if they won. His victory was so long in the past that it had become legendary, and the eventual dedication of his statue, I think, was due to superstition rather than any rational cause. Another Achaean athlete who was awarded a posthumous statue in Olympia was the wrestler Chilon of Patras. Pausanias again read the epigram inscribed on the statue base, which stated that he was twice Olympic victor and had additionally won twice in the Pythia, 3 times in the Nemean Games, and 4 times in the Isthmia. The inscription said that he was buried at public expense for his valor after he died in battle. It may well be that he was honored with a statue because he was a war hero rather than a periodonikis, which means a victor in all Panhellenic Games. As he won in the Olympic Games of 332 and again 328, he very likely died in the Lamian War against the Macedonians in 322. The statue base was signed by the famous 4th century sculptor Lysippos of Sicyon, according to the testimony of Pausanias. Lysippos' brother, Lysistratos, was said to have invented the life mask in order to achieve lifelike portraiture. But we do not expect this invention to have been of much use in the case of posthumous portraits. We will conclude this paper with further athletic portraits associated with the sculptor Lysippos. During the course of his visit to Olympia, Pausanias was much impressed by the memorial to Polydamas, or Poulidamas, following the Thessalian pronunciation. He was from Skotousa in Thessaly and won the Pancration in the Olympic Games of 408. Pausanias attributes the statue to Lysippos and says that it was placed on a tall pedestal and that Polydamas was the tallest man of his time. Pausanias states that Skotousa was destroyed by Jason of Pherae around 367 and that it was abandoned, but the site was still standing until the 1st century BC on the evidence of coins and inscriptions. A fragment of the inscribed limestone base was recently identified in the excavation storerooms of Olympia, and the writing probably belongs to the second half of the 4th century. From Skotousa can be easily read on the base. 2 fragments of Polydamas' sculptured statue base made of Pentelic marble were excavated in Olympia in the 1880s and were identified thanks to Pausanias' description of Polydamas' other exploits besides his victory in Olympia. The marble base would have stood above the inscribed limestone base. Polydamas was famous for his physical strength. He was said to have killed a lion on Mount Olympus with his bare hands in order to emulate Heracles. In addition, he seized a fierce bull by one of its hind legs and extracted the hoof. Finally, he was able to stop a galloping chariot by grabbing its back. Polydamas was invited to Susa by Darius II, king of Persia, to demonstrate his prowess. He challenged 3 of Darius' bodyguards to fights and killed them all. Pausanias informs us that some of Polydamas' exploits were represented on the statue base, while the others that were not represented were mentioned in the inscription. We expect that Lysippos also signed his name on the limestone base, but the name doesn't survive. The statue base is now in the Olympia Museum, and it is attributed to the workshop of Lysippus. Only 3 out of the 4 sculptured sides are still visible, and they're heavily damaged. The front face represents Polydamas's exploits in the court of Darius. On the left, we see Darius sitting on his throne. He is bearded and wears a long-sleeved tunic and a cloak, as well as a tiara with flaps falling on his shoulders. He lifts his right hand to his head in amazement. His left hand is raised, and it was once holding a painted scepter. Polydamas stands to right with his back on Darius. He lifts one of the Persian bodyguards' feet up over his shoulder. Enough of Polydamas survives to show that he is naked. Persians were usually depicted in Greek art fully clothed, but the image of the bodyguard here is almost lost, so we don't know how he was represented. Sorry. A group of 4 ladies in Greek garments overlooking the scene is shown on the right. They're dressed in Greek garments, not Persian. So the sculptor was clearly not familiar with Persian costumes, but he was not familiar with Persian customs either, because women would not have attended this kind of scene in the Persian court. The other 2 sides deal with Polydamas and the lion. On the left side, Polydamas strangles a lion with his bare hands. The lion stands on its 2 hind legs in a scene reminiscent of Heracles and the Nemean lion in Attic vase painting. I show you on the right a black figure neck amphora in the University of Mississippi. A tree is shown on the right on the Polydamas relief, but otherwise the background is smooth and may have carried a painted landscape. The right side of the base depicts the athlete sitting on the dead lion. Only the bottom of the scene survives, and we can see Polydamas's right hand placed on one of the hind legs of the beast. His right foot is firmly placed on the ledge at the bottom of the scene, while his left leg dangles free. The background is again blank, and we may expect painted scenery. The scene brings to the mind the west metopies of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, where Heracles has killed the lion of Nemea and steps on it. What Pausanias does not mention, but we hear it from Lucian, is that Polydamas' statue had acquired magic qualities and was supposed to heal fevers. But what had prompted the erection of the statue long after the athlete's death? It is now generally attributed to Thessalian national pride, which had been triggered with the support of Philip II of Macedon in the 330s. And this brings us to the final group of posthumous statues of athletes, the ancestors of Douchos II of Pharsalos in Thessaly. Douchos II of Pharsalos was a tetrarch of Thessaly, one of the 4 rulers of Thessaly, and an ally of Philip II of Macedon. This is attested by Demosthenes, who viciously attacks him in his speech on the crown. He attacks him because he's a friend of Philip. Most of the evidence on Douchos can be found in the inscribed statue bases of his monument at Delphi. Douchos served as hieromnemon in the Delphic Amphictyony between 336 and 332. During that period, he dedicated to Apollo a marble group of 6 ancestor portraits, as well as portraits of himself and his son, Sisyphus II. This family group may well have emulated the dynastic portraits erected by Philip II in the Philippion of Olympia between 338 and 336. And additionally, the group reflects Daohos' aspiration as a power broker in Thessaly. The ancestor portraits of Daohos were by definition posthumous. 3 of these ancestors were famous athletes. The statues are well documented by the inscriptions on their bases, naming the subjects and describing their achievements. There are no sculptor signatures. I illustrate here the statue bases in situ in 1949 in Delphi. Now, this no longer applies, because on the right, you can see the group as it now stands in the Delphi Museum, where they brought the bases. The bases were brought in by Petros Themelis when he was a curator of Delphi. So they're no longer in the monument. Now, some of the statues of the Daohos dedication were found near their bases, but others were collected far and wide in the sanctuary, and sometimes their attribution to the monument is disputed. In addition, it was recently argued that the monument was sheltered in a roofed building, which, however, collapsed in the early 320s because the foundation of the Acanthos column with the dancers, which dates from around 325, overlaps the building foundations. There's the monument, and there's the Acanthos column, which is above the foundations of the monument. Therefore, the monument no longer existed when they erected the dancers. And probably there was a landslide or an earthquake. That's why the monument collapsed. And that's why the statues are very fresh. The early disappearance of the monument would explain why Pausanias never saw it. Some of the statues of the Daohos monument are thought to have been buried in situ, but others could have been recycled and re-employed in other monuments, and that's why they were found so far away. Be that as it may, let us examine the evidence on the 3 athletes who were all active in the 480s. The statues were set up in chronological order from right to left. All 3 athletes were brothers. Of the 3 athletes, all shown naked, the Pancratiast Agias, who was the great-grandfather of Daohos II, is shown first on the right, and this is the best preserved statue. Its plinth is intact, fitting the cavity of the statue base, and therefore its identification is established. He is just over 2 meters high, and he is shown with legs spread, about to shift his weight from the right foot to the left. He is full of nervous energy. His cauliflower ears are appropriate to a boxer. He's already crowned victor, and this is indicated by the indentation left by the wreath on the back and sides of his head. So there was an extra wreath. The epigram on the statue base addresses the athlete. It identifies him as Agias, son of Acnonios of Pharsalos, and states that he was the first Thessalian to win the Pancration in the Olympic Games. It also states that he additionally won 5 times in the Nemean Games, 3 times in the Pythia, and 5 times in the Isthmia, and was never defeated. Two fragments of a similar statue base were identified by travelers in Pharsalos in the 19th century, and its inscription was recorded. That's the bottom inscription. The base has unfortunately vanished. The text mentions 5 victories in the Pythia, not 3, but the number was found to be erroneous. The statue base in Delphi originally reproduced the number 5, but this number was subsequently erased and replaced with the correct number 3, which was no doubt verified through the sanctuary records. This indicates that the statue of Agias in Pharsalos was earlier than the statue in Delphi. In addition, the statue in Pharsalos was actually signed by the sculptor Lysippos. It is usually assumed that the Pharsalos statue was the original in bronze, and that the marble Agias is a copy or a version created either by Lysippos or one of his students. We have no means of knowing if the Pharsalos statue was an isolated portrait or if it was part of a group, and whether Lysippos and his studio were responsible for the entire group at Delphi. Agias's brothers, Telemachos and Agelaos, stood at Agias's proper right. Telemachos is in the middle. His epigram is written in the first person singular. It's like he is talking, and informs us that he was Agias's brother and won wrestling victories on the same days and the same games as his brother. And that additionally, he killed against his will the strongest man in Etruria. This reconstruction includes a torso and some fragments of legs, which are very controversial, and I'm not sure at all that they belong to this statue. Sorry, and then we go to the youngest brother, Agelaos, on the left. He was shown third on the left. His epigram, again, assumes the subject's voice and tells us that he was a runner who won in the Pythia. There he is. Who won in the Pythia as a boy, at the same time as his brothers competed in combat games. It adds that they were the only brothers who managed to collect so many victories between them. The image of Agelaos, currently standing on his base, has been assembled of several pieces, which were found scattered all over the sanctuary. His feet with the plinth are missing. Therefore, his pertinence to the base is conjectural. The head was found at some distance from the torso and was attributed to this figure, even though he has cauliflower ears like a boxer, and the neck does not fit the shoulders. So I'm questioning this. I don't know if it goes there. Because of his raised shoulders, Agelaos is reconstructed as a diadumenos, binding a victory fillet on his head. He is shorter than the other two statues because he was a younger brother who competed in the boys category. In sum, the posthumous statues of athletes in the Dauchos monument were strongly idealized, supplementing the images with textual descriptions of the subject's achievements. And this can be made out by a survey. Inscriptions were in fact an essential element of posthumous athletic portraiture. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. A lot of food for thought. I noticed that you have many statues, of course. Do you have any paintings, you mentioned painting on stone, but any talk by Pausanias of paintings which commemorated a particular achievement?
No, I don't have any.
No. So I
We have paintings of athletes, but they're alive. We have a painting of Alcibiades in the Pinakotheki in the Acropolis of Athens, but he was alive when the painting was made. And he won in the chariot race in Nemea. Sorry, it's the Nemean Games.
So do you think that general practice was to prefer the making of statues for successful athletes
I think
rather
so,
than
yes.
painting, maybe as being more long-lasting or whatever?
I think so. It's long-lasting, and it's possible that the portrait of Alcibiades was paid for by himself because he was extremely vain. And we know he employed painters.
And he had money.
So he had money and he was very vain. So I personally believe that portrait he paid for.
Thank you.
You said that the statue of the third brother on the Daucus monument, right? The lower, it's reconstructed from parts found in different parts of the sanctuary. And the lower part doesn't necessarily fit the base and the head doesn't fit the neck.
Exactly.
And so is it possible that he's smaller, not because he was the youngest brother, but that statue, it doesn't fit? That's not the pieces that originally belonged there?
Well, I think that the torso does fit. Let's go back. There, see, he is younger. No, I think I'm not questioning the torso. I'm questioning only the head because it has cauliflower ears.
Right, but you said the feet don't fit the base either.
No, they don't, unfortunately. And the middle statue doesn't exist. I think it's just a construct. But I don't want to destroy all of them, so I would. I accept Agelaus, except his head. The middle one I don't accept, and the Agias, of course, fits perfectly, so he's okay. No.
No more questions, then all thanks.